Trump's planned tariffs on Canada and Mexico may be on hold for now, but they may have exposed a weak spot in America's lumber industry.
Lumber futures are, of course, higher given the news on the 25% tariff on Canada. Now, 1/3 of the lumber used in U.S. home building comes from Canada.
We don't need trees from Canada. We don't need cars from Canada. We don't need energy from Canada. We don't need anything from Canada. So,
President Trump is trying to break us so that America can own us. That will never, ever happen.
Trump's 35% tariff on Canadian softwood lumber was supposed to be a show of strength, a bring manufacturing home moment. Instead, Ontario just flipped the script. Overnight, America's single largest lumber supplier slammed the brakes, slashing exports, capping quotas, and redirecting shipments to Europe and Asia. Think about it. The U.S. builds nearly 1/3 of its homes with Canadian wood. Now, that supply line just got cut. And the fallout? Housing prices soaring, construction projects stalling, and an industry scrambling for answers. This isn't just another trade spat. It's economic sabotage dressed as retaliation. And the timing couldn't be worse, with lumber futures already climbing and American mills nowhere near ready to fill the gap. So how did Ontario manage to turn America's tariff weapon back on itself? Stick around, hit that like button, and subscribe, because what comes next will shock you. Let's start with the cold, brutal math. Every year, the United States imports about 28 million cubic meters of Canadian lumber. That's not a side order. It's nearly 1/3 of the total lumber America consumes. Put differently, without Canada, America is missing the wood for every third house it builds. Now here's the kicker. U.S. mills can only cover about 70% of domestic demand, even when running at full throttle. That leaves a 25 to 30% supply gap, a canyon that Canadian lumber has been filling for decades. Without it, the U.S. housing market doesn't just slow down, it cracks wide open. So when Trump's administration cranked tariffs from an already steep 14.54% all the way to 35% in August 2025,
Canada has been ripping us off for years on tariffs for lumber and for dairy products. They'll be met with the exact same tariff unless they drop it. And that's what reciprocal means.
Ontario didn't just shrug, they struck back, hard. Ontario announced new export quotas, essentially telling U.S. buyers, no, you can't just buy as much as you want anymore. And if that wasn't enough, they doubled down by shifting production away from raw softwood shipments and toward value-added engineered wood products, the kind that fetches premium prices in Europe and Asia. In one stroke, Ontario reduced the fire hose of raw softwood flowing south and rerouted it across the Atlantic and Pacific. This wasn't random, it was calculated. Ontario's forestry ministry backed the move with a $1.2 billion aid package, cushioning its own producers while punishing American builders. The message was clear. If Washington wants a trade war, Ontario is ready to fight it on its own terms. And here's where the chaos really begins. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange had already been jittery. Lumber futures in March 2025 were hovering around $650 per 1,000 board feet, which was already giving contractors migraines. With Ontario's retaliation in play, analysts began projecting a surge towards $765. That spike alone adds $10,000 to $30,000 to the cost of building a single-family home. Now, imagine what that means for buyers in Texas, California, or Florida, states where housing markets were already overheated. A $400,000 home suddenly jumps to $430,000 or even $450,000. And that's just the lumber component. When you factor in rising interest rates, material shortages, and higher wages, the American dream of affordable homeownership slips further out of reach. But this isn't just about money, it's about dependency. America loves to talk about self-sufficiency, about buying American and building at home. Yet when it comes to lumber, the numbers don't lie. The U.S. simply doesn't have enough domestic forest capacity to replace Canada's role. Trees take decades to grow, mills can't be built overnight, and retooling domestic supply chains, that's a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar endeavor. Meanwhile, Ontario is playing chess while Washington is still pounding the checkers board. By shifting its lumber flow to Europe and Asia, Ontario isn't just retaliating, it's building new long-term partnerships. Germany, Sweden, and even Japan have already stepped in, eager to secure stable contracts. For Ontario, diversifying away from America reduces vulnerability. For the U.S., it's a nightmare scenario. a reliable neighbor becoming a selective supplier. And let's not forget, alternatives aren't easy. Germany and Sweden combined can only provide about 3 million cubic meters of lumber to the US. That's a drop in the bucket compared to the 28 million cubic meters Canada used to send. Worse, those imports come with sky-high shipping costs, longer timelines, and volatile exchange rates. It's like trading a reliable grocery store next door for an expensive delivery service halfway across the world. This is the moment the illusion shatters. America thought tariffs would bring jobs home. Instead, they brought costs, chaos, and shortages. Ontario pulled the rug out, and now the US housing industry is wobbling on one leg. But that wasn't the whole story, because what happened next pushed prices even higher, hit middle-class families the hardest, and exposed just how unprepared the US was for a full-scale lumber squeeze. So here's where things go from bad to worse. When Ontario throttled the lumber pipeline, the first domino to fall was the US housing market. Lumber isn't just a commodity, it's the backbone of American construction. And when you inflate its price, everything tied to it inflates too.
The National Association of Home Builders, NHAB, wasted no time sounding the alarm. They warned that Ontario's restrictions would add 10 to 15% to overall construction costs nationwide. On paper, that sounds like a mild bump. In reality, it's catastrophic. For a typical single-family home, that translates into $10,000 to $30,000 slapped onto the final price tag. For families already locked out of the market by high mortgage rates, that extra cost might as well be a brick wall. And the impact isn't spread evenly. States like California, Texas, and Florida, where housing demand is sky-high, get hit hardest. Builders in those markets rely disproportionately on Canadian imports. Take Ontario out of the equation, and you're left with half-finished developments, spiraling material costs, and desperate contractors scrambling to secure supply at any price. It doesn't stop there. The ripple effect moves downstream. Hardware stores, furniture manufacturers, and even paper mills feel the squeeze. For small businesses, every uptick in lumber costs cuts into razor-thin margins. A carpenter in Ohio who once relied on steady supply from Ontario now finds himself bidding against multinational corporations just to get basic 2x4s. That's not competition, it's survival. Meanwhile, the US government's response? Pure damage control. Washington insists that tariffs will bring production back and strengthen domestic industries. But the hard truth is this: you can't fast-track a forest. Planting more trees today won't solve a shortage tomorrow. And as every contractor knows, sawmills don't materialize overnight. You can't wave a flag and conjure supply. That's exactly why Ontario's retaliation stings so sharply. They didn't just cut volume, they redirected it. While US builders are begging for shipments, Ontario's forestry sector is busy signing lucrative contracts with buyers in Europe and Asia. Germany and Sweden, already short on domestic timber, are thrilled to lock in stable supply. Japan, facing its own housing crunch, is equally eager. Ontario isn't just surviving, it's thriving by diversifying. In fact, Ontario is turning this crisis into opportunity. Instead of shipping raw logs, they're scaling up production of engineered wood products, laminated beams, cross-laminated timber, and other value-added exports that command higher margins abroad. Not only does this move cushion Canadian producers against US tariffs, it future-proofs their industry. In other words, they're moving up the food chain while America's left fighting over scraps. The result? The US share of Ontario's lumber exports is expected to fall from around 30% down to 23 or 24%. That may not sound like much, but in trade terms, it's massive. Once lost, market share doesn't easily return. Buyers in Europe and Asia won't abandon fresh contracts just because Washington decides it's finally ready to play nice. And while all this unfolds, American consumers are left footing the bill. Lumber prices spike, home ownership drifts further out of reach, and the construction industry bleeds. Tariffs meant to protect American jobs end up gutting them. A home builder in Michigan lays off workers not because demand has vanished, but because materials are too expensive to finish projects. That's the cruel irony of protectionism. It protects nothing and costs everything. But here's the real danger. This lumber standoff exposes a bigger vulnerability: America's myth of self-sufficiency. For years, Washington has preached independence in energy, manufacturing, and resources. But in 2025, a single province, Ontario, proved that it could squeeze the U.S. economy with the turn of a valve. If this is what happens with lumber, what would it look like with uranium, rare earths, or even water? That's the nightmare scenario policymakers don't want to admit. The U.S. built an empire on global supply chains, and now those chains are pulling tight. Ontario just demonstrated that allies can hit just as hard as adversaries, and sometimes they hit where it hurts most, in the wallet of the average American family. So let's call this what it is. America thought tariffs would be a weapon. Instead, they became a boomerang. Ontario didn't just fight back, it exposed the cracks in U.S. supply chains, the fragility of its housing market, and the myth of self-reliance. Lumber was supposed to be leverage. Instead, it became a liability. And this is only the beginning, because once a province like Ontario proves it can hit back, others are watching. What happens if Alberta does the same with oil, or if Quebec squeezes hydropower exports? The message is clear. America can't bully its way to prosperity, not when its neighbors hold the keys to critical resources. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit that like button, drop a comment, and make sure to subscribe, because the next chapter in this trade war, it's coming fast, and you'll want to see it first.